everyone, I hope you're all well. Just recording the first week one lecture for policing and governance. And we're talking about what policing governance actually is, which is a pretty simple concept really. So I'll just skip through a few key ideas, elaborate it just a tiny bit, and hopefully that'll get you thinking about this very broad, strange, unusual concept of policing governance. So there are a huge continuum of different types of policing systems that this slide kind of categorises into more control-dominated or more community-orientated. And there are so many different ways that a police organisation might be situated on that continuum. So, for instance, they might be very much control-dominated in their stop and frisk approaches that they use, depending on what circumstances they're in, whereas they might be very community orientated with LGBTI people in their liaison program that they've got and within the same police organisation. So there's a lot of different ways of thinking about how policing practices happen. And in terms of control-dominated organisations, they might be focused on maintenance of order, crimes considered an affront to authority, for instance. Oftentimes, the police organisations do lack legitimacy because ultimately the population don't trust the police, right? Things like that. They're highly paramilitary in their processes. Whereas the community-orientated organisations might be more likely to be focused on public services, might think of crime as a symptom of community problems, and the barriers between police and public are minimised overall. But the differences between these two ends of the scale, and I do talk about this a little bit on the Milo site material as well, is that it's the governance is what makes the difference, right? Depending on how things are governed, depends on how policing unfolds. So to start off with, I think it's pretty important that we define this notion of policing a little bit more clearly, because it can be interpreted in different ways depending what your definition is of the particular practice. So we need to firstly distinguish between the institution of the police and the various activities involved in policing work. Generally, when we think about policing, we think about a lot of different types of policing activities which are involved in policing work, and we therefore don't often think about the institution of the police. So I guess in this unit, we're focusing a little bit more on the institution of the police, but we're also talking about particular types of activities. We're generally focused on law enforcement and peacekeeping in terms of policing, but it's done by police and citizens as it now moves towards a pluralisation, which means it's not just about police as a government organisation, it's also about how private citizens and other private organisations like security organisations are involved in policing. But if we think of a general definition, this one that I've got here from Jones is a pretty good one. Policing is a set of functions and processes that form a subset of organised forms of social control. So it's about the regulation of people and practices. This includes individuals and it includes organisations involved in regulatory investigation and enforcement activities, part of whose defining purpose is to apply social controls. That's a bit of a mouthful, but you get the gist of what I'm talking about. So if we think about that as policing, then we need to put together that with governance, of course. So governance is related not just to policing, but the whole of the public sector. And that, of course, includes policing services. But we talk about governance of education and health and environment and all of those other things as well. So the definitions that we have of governance are very broad. Overall, they tend to focus on things such as systems of regulation and ordering that have developed in contemporary societies. These governing activities are dispersed through a network of agencies, and sometimes it can happen across a range of agencies. So the governance of emergency management, for example, involves police, departments of environment and heritage, involves banking sectors, it involves community organisations such as the Red Cross, and all of them have particular governance measures where they have to work together to make it work. Another really good definition of governance is one that I have up on the Milo site for you from OECD, which says the formal and informal arrangements that determine how public decisions are made and how public actions are carried out from the perspective of maintaining a country's constitutional values in the face of changing problems, actors and environments. Really good, nice, broad, general definition of that particular term. So there's a good way of thinking about this, I guess, and that's demonstrated in this particular slide. I've got a diagram. So we can talk about what we call supranational governmental institutions. So that's institutions that are above the state. So we've got the Australian Constitution, and then we can see legislative power, executive power, and judicial power coming down from that. And that flows down to the ministry and to government departments. And then below that, we've got local community governance, which is below the state. And all of that stuff in the middle is the state. So a supranational governmental institution might be thought of as the War Crimes Tribunal, right? United Nations and the human rights frameworks, that's definitely supranational. So things like that are above the state. Then we have the stuff in the middle that is the state. And then we have the stuff below the state, which is about local community governance. For this unit then, we're talking about governance as governmental strategies originating both from within and outside the state. The constitutional and institutional arrangements for framing and directing the policies of the police. And of course, there's an implied belief in the continued relevance and importance of state organised policing arrangements. And this is really important because if the police are not thought about in that way, if for some reason the population wake up tomorrow and say, hey, these police are not doing a great job, we need to get rid of them, then the public confidence that we have in police is shattered. And that means that they don't necessarily have the power to continue to govern the populace. So when we think about governance in the context of policing, this is what we're talking about. It encompasses the procedures and methods aimed at ensuring the efficient discharge of the policing function. As such, it includes a whole range of management issues. So policy formation, determination of priorities and strategies, deployment choices, allocation of resources, maintenance of standards, internal discipline, interaction with government and other external bodies in context of formal accountability processes. So for instance, in Victoria, we have Victoria Police over here, but we have IBAC over here, which is an external oversight body that actually sort of governs what Victoria Police do. So it's useful to think about governance of policing, I think, in terms of steering. So these governance bodies, regardless of whether they're external or internal, and the policies around them determine the direction of that police organisation. So good governance involves the use of properly constituted, legitimate power and authority to make decisions about how to direct the collective efforts and resources of the group to achieve their stated aims and objectives. And of course, this applies to police as well. So governance of police happens at a range of different levels. It happens right down at the level of the person, like me, the individual officer, although I'm not an officer, just saying, but the individual officer. Then it happens across the whole organisation. And then we've got state regulations. And then we've got federal level regulations. Then we've got national cross-border stuff that happens. And then even higher from that is the international policing and Interpol and policekeeping stuff. All of these things constitute police governance, and we will talk about all of them in future lectures in a little bit more detail. A good example of this is the Scottish police model, where we can see that they have policing principles in place, and when looking at the Act here that's available online, but they are actually influenced directly by human rights principles in particular. So Policing for them is about improving the safety of well-being of persons, localities and communities in Scotland. And they work in collaboration with local communities, and they work to prevent crime, harm and disorder in doing that. So this legislation controls what Scottish police are doing on a day-to-day basis. And when you do look at the Reform Act that came through in 2012, you'll see that it's directly informed by human rights, which is very, very rare. So why are we talking about this? Because there are so many different elements which are now informing the ways that policing organisations are governed, and the ways then that means that policing happens in a day-to-day environment. We've got lots of different types of knowledges, things around human rights, even globalisation affects policing and the way that it's governed on a daily basis. So whether or not VicPol is reticent to share information with Interpol about a particular case which has started in Victoria, that's controlled by governance. So VicPol might be reticent, but there might be legislation that says, who cares? You haven't got a choice. You've got to provide that information to Interpol. Diversity also makes a huge difference. Mobility makes a massive difference as well. The complexity of policing work and all of the factors that are involved, as well as urbanisation and technology. So all of these things mean that policing is governed in specific ways, and that can change on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a yearly basis, but most importantly, it can be decided from week to week, day to day, minute to minute, and sometimes in a matter of seconds. So there's a whole bunch of other change that happens in police organisations, and particularly in the last 50 years or so, which Walsh and Conway talk about in quite a bit of detail. And this is one of your readings that you will do during the course. They talk about the growth of coercive police functions and powers, a lot of new technologies, a shift towards problem solving and intelligence as opposed to just overbearing force. They have trained armed combat units, which have really required a lot of special governance. Definitely arming rank and file police with lethal and semi-lethal weaponry has required particular types of governance. Expanding range of police organisations, specialisations within police orgs like SWAT, for example, and of course the blurring of policing and security in particular. The growth of private sector policing and security guards and private investigators. The growth of cross-border cooperation has changed it as well, in addition to private sector business managerial approaches that have been taken on board by police. There's education and training advances that have been made. There's been a massive reliance on professional standards and internal affairs and whistleblowing processes, in addition to expanding civilian oversight, even to the point now where some organisations that are community-based have apps on their phones, right, where a civilian can download the app and record a police interaction in real time, upload that immediately to the server of that local community organisation and have it investigated for that person, have the police investigated for that person without having the police involved in it whatsoever. It's extraordinary. In addition to things like centralised government control, and we will talk about that in a bit more detail. So there is so much change. It is just unbelievable, exponential, and it's happening really rapidly. So we really do need to talk about this stuff more. And in addition to that, there's a lot of diversity in how police services are structured and governed and delivered. For instance, in the US, there are 6 levels of law enforcement. Federal, where there's 50 agencies that have specialist responsibilities. There's state, and of course there's 49 states that have 58,000 police officers that are accountable to state governors. Then we have county levels where there's more than 189 police officers. There's city police forces there are literally 2,400 plus officers in those cities, and there's 3,200 plus city police forces. Then we have rural police forces and special districts. I could go on, but I won't. So really, in America, shit tons of policing at so many different levels. Whereas Sweden and Ireland have both one centralised national police force. Very fascinating stuff. Japan has a centrally administered police service that's divided into 47 local prefectures. On a local level, they act out of police substations known as kaban, and in cities, in rural areas, they have a different name again. So really different delivery of these different services means different types of governance for those circumstances. Most importantly, the reason why we're talking about this is that there's a very close relationship between the legitimacy of democratic organisations like the police and the way that the community think about police, and we will talk about this in a lot more detail. Systems of police governance definitely must promote democratic policing, but as we know, that doesn't always happen, and that's why oversight happens, and of course that's part of police governance. There's 7 great democratic criteria that Jones talks about as something that we need to move towards in order to ensure policing happens in a good light, right? And that members of the public, most importantly, are protected. That's equity, service delivery, responsiveness, distribution of power, information, redress, and participation. And I'm not going to go through these because we do talk about that further down the track. But this really is a balancing act because police powers are there to protect the fundamental liberties of people everywhere, but they can also end up severely abusing these freedoms in a whole range of different circumstances, and we will be learning more about that as well. Something else that's really important is that changes in one geographical location around police work can be completely different if we apply it to a different area entirely. All policing systems particularly they're embedded in a wider structure and most importantly a wider culture of different societies, and this will always influence the way that policing is governed. And this final point about why we need to talk about governance and policing relates back to one of the most important and the reason why we really do this unit, because how we govern policing organisations is linked very strongly to how accountable they are and the extent to which they are considered legitimate by the public. And we will talk about this in quite a lot more detail in coming weeks. Most importantly, we have a colonial policing context in Australia, and the ways that Aboriginal policing was delivered, and most importantly the way that Aboriginal people were policed, has a significant knock-on effect to the way that policing happens for these communities in the current environment. And again, this is something that we will talk about in a lot more detail. Anyway, in summary, governing police is an imperative practice given the very fine line between positive and negative policing interactions and practices, and we must do this to preserve the human rights of all involved with policing in some way, and that includes the police officers, not just members of the public, because this will ensure transparency and accountability of policing practices into the future. Anyway, folks, I hope that was helpful. That's where I'm going to leave you this evening. Have a wonderful week, and I look forward to chatting to you all again next week. See you later.